When we think about the injustices faced by Native Americans, our minds often jump to images of violent conflict and forced relocation. But there's a quieter, more insidious form of suffering, one born not from the battlefield, but from the stroke of a pen. It's the suffering caused by broken promises, the deep and lasting wounds inflicted by treaties signed in good faith but rarely honored. The story isn't just about what was taken by force. It's about what was promised but never given, especially one of the most fundamental promises of all: protection. Let's travel back to the 18th and 19th centuries. As the United States expanded westward, it encountered hundreds of distinct and sovereign native nations. Instead of immediate conquest, the primary method of interaction was through treaties. These weren't just land deals, they were legally binding agreements between nations. In these documents, a common theme emerged. Native tribes would cede vast territories, sometimes millions of acres of their ancestral lands. In exchange, the US government would make a solemn promise. They promised to protect the tribes within their new, smaller, and clearly defined reservations. They promised to shield them from encroachment by settlers, from violence, and from theft. The language was often clear. The United States would guarantee their safety and their right to live undisturbed. Take the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 with the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. It established the Great Sioux Reservation and explicitly stated that no white person would be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in the territory without the consent of the Indians. It was a promise of a safe haven, a sanctuary guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. This wasn't an isolated case. Hundreds of treaties contained similar clauses promising peace, friendship, and protection. For Native leaders, these weren't just words on paper. They were sacred oaths, the foundation upon which a new, albeit difficult, future could be built. They agreed to give up their traditional way of life, their freedom to roam and hunt across vast lands, based on the assurance that their families and their remaining territory would be secure. But what happened when these promises were put to the test? Almost immediately, the ink was barely dry on these treaties before they were violated. The lure of gold, land, and resources proved far more powerful than the government's sworn word. In the Black Hills, sacred to the Lakota and supposedly protected by the Fort Laramie Treaty, the discovery of gold in the 1870s triggered a massive influx of miners and settlers. Did the US Army, tasked with upholding the treaty, turn them away? No. Instead of protecting the Lakota's land, the military was soon sent to protect the trespassers, eventually leading to war to force the Lakota to cede the Black Hills. The promise of protection had transformed into an instrument of conquest. This pattern repeated itself across the continent. In the Pacific Northwest, treaties promised tribes the right to fish in all their usual and accustomed places. This was a critical provision, as fishing was central to their economy, culture, and survival. But, as settlers poured in, they built dams that blocked salmon runs, polluted rivers, and physically barred native people from accessing their fishing sites. When tribes tried to assert their treaty rights, they were often met with arrest, violence, and state-level laws designed to override federal treaties. The government that had promised to protect their way of life stood by, or actively assisted, as it was dismantled piece by piece. The failure of protection wasn't just about land and resources. It was deeply personal and incredibly violent. Settlers, miners, and so-called militias frequently launched brutal attacks on native villages, often with impunity. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864 is a horrifying example. A peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho, who believed they were under the protection of the US Army and were even flying an American flag, was attacked by a volunteer cavalry. Hundreds of men, women, and children were slaughtered. Instead of justice for the victims, some of the perpetrators were hailed as heroes. The government's promise to protect its wards was a hollow, meaningless phrase in the face of racial hatred and land greed. This erosion of trust had devastating consequences that ripple into the present day. When the one entity that promised you safety is the very source of your danger, or, at the very least, a passive observer to your destruction, what are you left with? This created a cycle of poverty and dependence. Confined to reservations, with their traditional economies destroyed and promised government rations often arriving late. Spoiled, or not at all, tribes were left in a state of perpetual crisis. Starvation and disease became rampant. The lack of federal protection made them vulnerable to exploitation by corrupt agents and local businessmen who sought to strip them of what little they had left. The legal and political ramifications are still being untangled today. For over a century, tribes have had to fight relentless battles in court, not to gain new rights, but simply to force the United States to honor the promises it made 200 years ago. The Supreme Court has, at times, affirmed these treaty obligations, famously describing them as the supreme law of the land. Yet, enforcement remains a constant struggle. Cases over water rights, fishing rights, and land jurisdiction are still being litigated, a testament to the enduring legacy of these broken promises. This isn't just ancient history. The failure to protect has evolved. Today, it manifests as jurisdictional chaos that allows criminals to prey on native communities, particularly women. Due to a complex web of laws stemming from these old treaties and subsequent court rulings, tribal police often lack the authority to prosecute non-natives who commit crimes on tribal land. This has created a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. Or, MMIW. Perpetrators know they can often act with impunity in Indian country. A modern-day failure of the most basic promise of protection. Federal agencies are underfunded and spread thin, and justice for native victims is tragically elusive. So, when we talk about the history of Native Americans, let's remember that the story is more complex than just battles and massacres. It is a story of profound betrayal. A story of nations who negotiated in good faith, who ceded their world based on a promise of security, only to find that promise was worthless. The suffering wasn't just physical. It was a deep psychological and spiritual wound. The loss of trust in the word of a government, the realization that the documents meant to ensure your survival were actually just tools to manage your decline. Understanding this history is crucial. It reframes the challenges Native communities face today, not as failures of their own, but as the direct, predictable outcome of generations of broken promises. The fight for sovereignty, for cultural preservation, and for basic safety is a continuation of the fight that began the moment the first treaty was violated. It's a fight to hold a nation to its word and to finally receive the protection that was guaranteed centuries ago. Recognizing this truth is the first step toward a more just future. Thank you for watching. If this history is important to you, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world. See you next time.